Magnus Carlsen destroying Alireza Firouzja with the King's Gambit opening? Are you kidding me? Okay, in the game, Magnus Carlsen is playing as white, and of course, he goes straight for the King's Gambit opening on move 2. Now, of course, the idea behind the King's Gambit is you are sacrificing the pawn on the f4 square. The idea with this is you want to deflect the pawn away from e5. That way, you can go d2 to d4, trying to control the center of the board. And that is what happens in the game. Alireza takes the pawn on f4. He's ready for a fight. Now, Magnus, knight f3, the main move. And now here, Alireza Firouzja goes for the most aggressive option on the board. That is, of course, g5. You are launching that kingside pawn down the board, and supporting the pawn on the f4 square is now going to be almost impossible for white to win f4 back. Now from here, Magnus, knight c3, developing the quayside, and here Alireza immediately lunges forward with the pawn g4. Now this is a very double-edged idea. Of course, you are gaining more space on the king side and knocking the knight away from the f3 square. However, both of these pawns are now vulnerable. The f4 pawn can be won by the bishop, and the g4 pawn by the queen at some point. So Alireza has to be super careful here. Now Magnus, he jumps forward with the knight to e5. Clearly the best move. Now both the knight and the queen are targeting the pawn on g4. And here already, Alireza has a very critical decision to make. He has to find a way to strike back in the center immediately. Now here, the best move is actually d5. This is not an easy move to find. The threat of this move is you want to go either d4 next, or the incredible idea queen h4 check. So overall, d5, looking like it sacrifices a pawn. This is definitely the best move on the board. But instead of that, here, Alireza instead plays the move d6. Now, this is a little bit more passive. I mean, you're just inviting white to recapture the pawn on the g4 square with the knight. And that is what Magnus Carlsen does. Knight takes g4. Here, Magnus, he just wins back his pawn. Black has the very vulnerable double pawns on the f-file. Magnus can go d4, claiming the center. And here, it's not really clear what Alireza has to show for his opening. Okay, now from here, the best move for Alireza is once again queen h4 check, pitting both the king and the knight. That is going to force the knight back to the f2 square. And from here, black can go knight f6 and just continue developing with an okay game. However, Alireza does not find this move queen h4. Instead, the immediate knight f6 on the board, Alireza is offering the knight trade. If white goes knight takes f6, black would recapture with the queen, and that would give black excellent development. So of course, Magnus Carlsen does not want to make the game easier for black. With that in mind, he just retreats the knight to f2. And f2 is a very weird looking square for the knight that typically goes to the f3 square. However, here it kind of works out. Now, Alireza rook to g8, activating the rook on the g file, pressuring g2. However, the drawback of this move is the king is no longer going to be able to castle on the king side. So, a very double-edged idea in this game. Now, Magnus, d4, is simply taking control of the center and pressuring f4 with the bishop. I mean, if Magnus won that f4 pawn, he'd be up a full pawn with the center. That would be just a devastating advantage. So with that in mind, Alireza, bishop to h6. I mean, not the typical square you would see the bishop on. However, here does a fantastic job of defending f4. So very creative play. Now Magnus, queen f3, again pressuring that pawn. And while white is threatening to simply win the pawn on f4 with bishop takes f4, it does leave the pawn on d4 vulnerable. Keep in mind, the queen used to defend this, but now it's no longer defending the pawn. And with that in mind, Alireza, knight to c6, immediately challenging that pawn on the d4 square. Now, Magnus Carlsen here, he has a few different options to deal with this threat. One idea is bishop b5, trying to pin the knight. A second idea is d5, simply hitting the knight. However, that might not be the best idea, because then still the knight can jump into d4, pressuring the queen. And finally, you could theoretically try to defend the pawn on d4. However, there isn't really an easy way to do that right now. So in the end, Magnus finds maybe the strongest idea is simply bishop b5, putting pressure on the knight on c6, and even preparing short castles in some lines. Now, it's not really clear yet where the white king is going to want to go, either on the king side or the queen side, but this is a very flexible idea, bishop b5 here. Now, Alireza, bishop d7, removing the pin on the knight, and of course, renewing the threat. Knight takes d4, so Magnus has to do something about it. In the game, he takes the knight on c6, bishop takes, bishop takes. Now, of course, grandmasters typically don't want to give up that bishop pair without a good reason. Now, of course, black having the two bishops versus Magnus Carlsen's one. However, here, Magnus does have a good reason. He is trying to win win that pawn on the f4 square, and that is what he does. However, here there was probably a better way to win that pawn on f4, and that would have involved castling first. The idea is if you short castle, then that pawn on the f4 square is going to fall sooner or later, but you also defend the pawn on g2, and that's going to be very important in the line that Magnus Carlsen played in the game. So going back to the game here, Magnus, instead of short castle, he takes the pawn on the f4 square with the bishop. However, here after bishop takes, queen takes, then the pawn on g2 is going to fall, and that is what happens. Bishop takes, queen takes, rook takes g2, and it turns out with that g2 pawn falling, black here starts to get a little bit of counterplay. Now Magnus from here, he long castles, clearly the best square for the king, and in this position and in many follow-up positions, the best move for Alireza Firouzja as black is going to be the idea of knight h5, pressuring the queen, then following up with queen g5 check. Of course, the queen is going to be defended by the rook on g2, and this is going to give black a tremendous amount of play on the king side. However, that is not what Alireza Firouzja goes for. Here instead, queen e7, already a little bit of a mistake, and this gives Magnus enough time to pile up on the f-file with the move rook h to f1. Of course, the idea is the rook and queen have pressure on the knight on f6 and the pawn on the f7 square. Now here in the game, Alireza Firouzja just goes ahead and castles queenside, but once again, knight to h5 was the best idea here real fast. For example, black goes knight h5, then Magnus retreats the queen. Black's going to go queen g5 check, forcing king b1 from white, and only then long castles. And in this kind of position, all of the pieces are very active on the king side, the queen, the rook, and the knight. Of course, the bishop also doing a pretty good job. But compare that to the move in the game after rook f1, where Alireza castles queenside. Here, all of these kingside pieces are just a little bit more passive, and that is definitely going to come back to bite Alireza Firouzja in the you-know-what later in this game. Now here, Magnus, perhaps the best idea would have been trying to keep the pawns on the d4 and the e4 squares. So for example, there are a wide variety of improvement moves you could make. King b1, rook e1, queen h4, trying to pile up on the pawn on h7 and pin the knight to the queen. However, instead of that, Magnus here, he jumps forward with the d-pawn, d5. Of course, this was a blitz game, so fighting for the initiative in blitz is very important. And Alireza plays the very natural-looking move, bishop d7. I mean, this is the move almost any human player would make. However, there was a better idea here. Instead of bishop d7, the key move is actually bishop to e8. Now, unless you're a future world champion of chess like Hans Niemann, this move is going to look a little bit weird, but the idea is you want to preemptively defend that pawn on the f7 square. This way, later, after these knights get removed from the f-file, that pawn is going to be defended twice by the queen and the bishop, relieving white's pressure on the f-file. And beyond that, it also gives black the idea of going knight to d7 and then later e5. Of course, the d7 square is now available for the knight. If the bishop was on d7, that would not be possible. So bishop e8, really cool idea. Instead, the more natural-looking move, bishop b7, played in the game. But again, this is a big mistake from black. Now Magnus, he plays the logical move, knight to d3, trying to get the knight into the game and also freeing up that pressure on the f-file. Now both the knight and the pawn are indirectly attacked. Now here, once again, the best move from black is going to be that move we talked about over and over, knight to h5. The idea you follow up with queen g5, trying to activate everything on the king side. So for example, best move, knight to h5. White here is going to capture that pawn on the f7 square, but then black has queen g5 check. Then after king b1, which is basically forced, black's going to go bishop e8, once again defending. And here, black is doing relatively okay once again. Of course, the pawn on h2 is going to fall sooner or later, and black has pretty good counterplay. But instead of all this, here in this position, knight g4 on the board. Now, of course, the idea behind knight g4 is you are getting rid of the knight on the f-file. That way, queen takes f6 is not a threat. However, here, Magnus, he finds the best idea, h3, putting pressure on the knight. The knight is forced to go to the e5 square, and then Magnus trades twice on the e5 square. Knight takes, queen takes, pawn takes, and now, all of a sudden, the f7 pawn is vulnerable, and Magnus just picks it up. Rook takes f7, and here, Magnus, he has probably the the biggest advantage he's had so far in the game. I mean, he is just really starting to pull away in this endgame. Now, of course, Magnus is up one single pawn, that pawn on the d file, and that is potentially enough to win the game. Now here, black, the pawn h7 being attacked. Alireza goes h5, trying to defend, but Magnus just goes rook h7, piling up on the pawn. And now from here, both sides lose their h-pawns. Bishop takes, rook takes, and now that there's no more pawns on the king side, that can only favor Magnus Carlsen, as he has the knight against Alireza's bishop. Of course, when you have the knight against the bishop in the endgame, you want all of the pawns on one side of the board, as it makes it so much easier for your knight to jump around and clean up. Meanwhile, the bishop is more of a long-range attacking piece, and it doesn't do as well with pawns on one side of the board. Now from here, Alireza, bishop g4, it looks like he's forking both the rook on h5 and the rook on the d1 square. However, after rook to g5, here Magnus pins the bishop to the rook on the g1 square, meaning bishop takes g1 is met with rook takes g2. So Alireza, he starts the counterattack, rook f8. Of course, in rook endgames, the most important thing you can do is try to have your rooks as active as possible. Here, black is going to threaten rook f2 in many, many lines. And already Magnus has to be super, super careful. He starts rook h1, activating the rook on the h-file. And here it looks like the best idea for Alireza would, of course, be rook f2, doubling up the rooks on the second rank. However, that is not a very good move here. So, for example, here, if black goes rook to f2, then the problem is Magnus could just go rook g8, king d7, rook g7, king d6, and then he can cut off the a5 square with the knight to a4. And here, black's king is going to be stuck in some sort of mating net, and if black ever takes on c2, eventually the b2 pawn is going to be defended by the knight, removing any second rank threats. So overall, rook f2 in this position would have been a big mistake. Alireza spots that idea. Instead, he goes a6. The idea is he may want to go b5, trying to gain space on the queen side. Now, Magnus here, he has a big decision to make. The most obvious move, of course, is going to be rook takes e5, just gobbling up the hanging pawn. I mean, what could be more simple than that? However, if Magnus went for that, he would be in deep trouble. There's a big problem with rook takes e5. And here, black can actually go rook f2, and there are a tremendous amount of threats. I mean, the best line from here is going to be king b1, rook takes c2, and then king a1. The idea is you always have the idea of knight b1 trying to defend against back rank mate threats in the future. However, this is not a very fun position to play. So instead of that, on move 26, Magnus Carlsen finds an incredible idea, just backing up a little bit here in this position. He plays the prophylactic move, king to b1. Now, this move may look a little bit strange. I mean, typically when black has back rank mate threats, you don't go king b1, making it easier for that to happen in the future. However, the idea is if black ever doubles up rooks on the second rank, Magnus is going to have the resource rook to c1, defending the c2 square. Wow, really interesting stuff from Magnus. Now again, Alireza has a critical decision. The most tempting idea is going to be rook f2, but again, that move is just booby-trapped. Here, I'll show you the main line. Alireza goes rook f2, then Magnus goes rook h8, king d7, rook g7, king d6, and now b4. Again, the idea is you're blocking off the c5 square, and here the computer already gives a forced mate in 10 moves, believe it or not. So Alireza, maybe he calculated all of this, the forced mate in 10 moves, maybe he didn't, but either way, his spidey senses were tingling. He knew not to go rook f2, and instead he immediately gained space on the queen side with the move b5. Now from here, Magnus takes the pawn on e5, finally, and Alireza goes rook to f2, doubling up rooks on the second rank. Now Magnus, rook to c1. We're seeing the idea of the very brilliant prophylactic move king b1 played earlier. And here it's looking like Magnus Carlsen is simply up 2 pawns. I mean, yes, Alireza has the counterplay with the 2 rooks on the second rank. However, this is going to be a very, very difficult defense for black. Now, Alireza, bishop d7, retreating the bishop, and Magnus starts to gain some space on the queen side with a3 and then b4. And as a side note, if you're a beginner, typically in the endgame, when you have a material advantage, maybe 1 or 2 extra pawns, it's typically a good idea to go g4 at h3 on one side of the board, trying to gain space with your pawn majority. Now here, Alireza, rook f3, targeting the knight on the f3 square. Magnus defends, king to b2, and here Alireza tries to block the queen side with the move a4. a4. Now we have a relatively fixed structure on the queen side that is going to be good for black, as there just aren't any good pawn breaks on the queen side now. Now here, Magnus, he is basically completely winning. He has a variety of things he could do. In the game, he goes for the move d6. Now, this is sort of a temporary pawn sacrifice. The idea is he wants to clear square d5 for the rook. That is what happens. C takes d6, then rook d5. Again, the idea. And if black defends the pawn on d6 with king c7, then of course the b5 pawn is going to fall. That's what happens. Knight takes b5, bishop takes, rook takes. And here Magnus is still up 2 pawns, and the pieces are starting to fly off the board. As more and more pieces come off, that's going to help Magnus more and more. Now here Alireza plays a very flashy idea. I quite like this. Rook b3. Alireza gets style points for this move. Of course, the king can't take the rook as it's defended by the pawn, and the pawn can't take the rook as is pinned to the king. So very stylish idea. Now, king a2, rook c3. The idea is if Magnus retreats, king b2, Alireza goes for a forced draw by repetition with the move rook to b3. Though Magnus avoids rook a5. Now we have a bunch of pawns flying off the board. Rook takes, rook takes, rook takes, king b1, rook e2, then rook takes a4, and finally rook takes e4. Now we have just a rook endgame, 2 pawns for Magnus versus 1 for Alireza Firouzja. This advantage should be enough to win the game, and that is exactly what happens. Magnus Carlsen from here, he just cleans up with his signature endgame technique. He is the best endgame player in the world, and in the end, Alireza Firouzja can simply not stop Magnus Carlsen's pawns, and he resigns on move 54. Wow, what a game by Magnus Carlsen, simply destroying Alireza Firouzja with the old-school King's Gambit. You simply do not see that opening these days too much, so very impressive stuff.